All right, well, thank you all for spending your afternoon with us here at the Blanden Art Museum. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces, which is really fantastic. So just a little plug, if you haven't followed us yet on Facebook, please do. We post a lot of our events and things that are happening here at the museum on our Facebook page, but also on our website as well. So if you're looking for something to do, there's always something to do here at the Blanden. We've got not only amazing artwork up to see, but we also have a lot of classes and activities we do for the community as well. So if you're looking to do some artwork, we have an amazing art educator, and we have a whole bunch of different classes for this fall. So take a look at our website to find those out, and again, thank you. So we're here, and we got the artist Steve Maeck, whose amazing work is upstairs. Fantastic metalwork, and I think it's a really great honor to have Steve not only exhibit here at the museum, but also, you know, we do have a piece in our permanent collection that's currently up in the East Gallery. So if you haven't, or the West Gallery, if you haven't had a chance to go through that gallery, make sure you spend some time to see Stephen's work in there. With that, I'll hand it over to Stephen and let him do the official introduction to himself. So let's give a warm welcome to Stephen.
Well, thank you all for coming today. I was telling my good and old friends, Kelly and Dennis Chernishow, who've come all the way from Chicago today to see this exhibit. We originally were friends from long, long ago, from high school times in Vermont, and have remained friends. And Kelly and Dennis came today to see my exhibit, which Eric chose the pieces, came over to our place in Baroque, Iowa, near Decorah, and selected 15 pieces that he thought he could arrange in a room in a compelling way. So I thank Eric for the opportunity. The opportunity arose from my finding the famous Blanden Blue Book in a junk shop in Decorah for 50 cents. It was 50 cents very well invested. Because by the time I got through it, I was online discovering who the current director of the Blanden was. And I sent Eric a copy of a book that I've created of my work, and I didn't hear anything. No thank you. No, hats off to you, Steve. You know, maybe I'll stop by sometime in the next decade. But lo and behold, you just have to take a breath, because, you know, people are busy with their own lives. And about 3 months later, I got this very nice note, a handwritten letter put in the mail, which is a rare creature these days. And the note conveyed something about the writer of the note. And Eric was asking me questions about my work and about, you know, did I ever sell pieces, etc. And so that was the beginning of a relationship, which then evolved into a couple of phone calls, and finally Eric was able to make the not inconsiderable trip from Fort Dodge to Baroque, which is about 175 miles, to see our home in Baroque, which is set up to not only produce, but to display large welded steel sculptures that tend to be happiest outdoors. So we have a couple of old farmhouses there, and we have enough property that I've you know, littered the property with concrete pads, and I've mounted mostly my larger pieces outside on these beds. And I also purchased from a local farmer. I don't know if you've ever noticed, there are literally thousands and thousands of corrugated steel circular grain bins all over Iowa. Well, most people don't think of them in a purely architectural sense, but that was the first thing that I thought of. And so I moved a couple of grain bins onto our property and had circular pads made for them. And I revised them to make them a little more aesthetically appealing than their usual sort of silver gray surface. And I use them to put my medium size and my smaller pieces in, because working in steel, steel always moves in the direction of rust. And I didn't want to always be cleaning up rusty pieces if I was sending them out on exhibition. Anyway, Eric came over and we had a very nice day walking around looking at my work, and I made him lunch, which he seemed to appreciate. And that was the beginning of the exhibit that you see upstairs. All 15 pieces Eric selected on a subsequent visit, and I can tell from the way that he's arranged them upstairs, he saw, even though they are all unique and uniquely different, he saw a relationship, a sort of gestalt that existed among them all when they're placed together in an environment. And I don't know if you folks have, would acknowledge the same presence, but it was obvious to me when I walked in today that Eric had done a wonderful job of arranging them. I think that, speaking extemporaneously about my life as a sculptor, which has been an evolutionary process literally over my entire life. But in the beginnings, it was such a faint and chronologically disparate experience that I didn't even know that a vocation in art was evolving. When I was about 11 years old, my parents, I was raised in Burlington, Vermont. My father was a physician, and my mother was a devoted physician's wife. She made a beautiful setting for my father to rise out of to practice medicine. This was a mutually agreed upon arrangement, so no one was being deprived or inordinately misused. But they were very intent about having a beautiful environment to live in. So my mother always had objects around the house that were aesthetically stimulating. But in late 1950s, early 1960s Burlington, even though it was a city with institutions of University of Vermont and other institutions of higher learning, it was still pretty provincial. And one thing that they did, which really impressed me, is they engaged a sculptor friend of theirs who was, by all descriptions, a modernist sculptor working in forged iron sculpture. They commissioned a piece from him of a lovely nude woman done completely in forged iron. And when the piece was completed, they mounted it on a pedestal and put it on their living room wall, scandalizing many of the people who came to their cartoon class. But that had a profound effect on me because, first of all, I innately loved the sculpture. Secondly, I ended up knowing for most of my life until his death in his early 70s, the sculptor personally, a man named Paul Aschenbach. And Paul was a sort of legend in the part of Burlington, part of Vermont that I grew up in. He taught sculpture at the University of Vermont for probably 30 years. He was the first and only non-tenured, non-advanced degree, tenured, non-advanced degree professor at the University of Vermont, just because he was such a good teacher. But I mention that because I would just say that was the beginning of my interest in metal sculpture. And I spent decades after that not believing that I had artistic motivations within me. I believed that I needed to fulfill other expectations about being a citizen in America and making a living. And it took me a long time to get over that. And but I always was aware in the background that I had an attraction and an affinity to steel and iron. And there would be times in my life when for example, I was a medic in the U.S. Army in the early 70s, and I walked into a bookstore, and I don't know what directed me to do it, but I bought a book about the sculpture of David Smith. And I lugged that book around with me all over parts of America and Europe, and almost like it was my favorite book, but for no good reason. So then I would say the next development in not admitting to myself that I wanted to create art was to become an art dealer. And so for 25 years, I worked as a gallerist. I had my own gallery in Manhattan and in Key West, and I was an itinerant gallerist for 10 years, and working primarily with rare and antique Oriental rugs and modern art and unusual objects. About 15 years ago, I did the downtown Manhattan Modernism show at the Downtown Gallery. And I invested $4,000 in my booth and in my travel expenses to be able to do that show for 4 days. And I invested $4,000 and I took in $5,000 for risking my life for a whole week and for repeating the answer to the question, well, is he listed? Is the artist listed? And I would say, yeah, he's listed in the Akron phone book because most of the time the objects that I was interested in were either anonymous or done by unknown, unlisted artists. My preoccupation was totally within the resonance of the artwork itself. And if it had that quality of life, of being alive, then I would have it in my inventory. But most of the time, people were looking for other requirements, which included buying art for investment. So after that particular show, where I lost money and as I said, risked my life for a week in New York, I drove out of town, I packed up my booth, I drove out of town and stopped at the first rest area on the New Jersey Turnpike and spent the night in my van woke up in the morning and cried for 5 minutes. And then I said, you know what? I can stay home and lose money. So that, in effect, was the beginning of my making things. Is I finally gave up on trying to make money in art, and decided to pursue the fulfillment of my desire to make something resonant and beautiful. And what I found out was that all these years of being involved in the business of art, of reaching in my pocket for my money, my hard-earned money, to purchase something that I thought was valid and compelling. That all of those experiences had informed my eye and my consciousness as to what resonance and beauty really was. And I found that as I started to make things, to assemble things and create things, that all those years of arranging, choosing, looking into had not been wasted, because it was in a day-to-day way, in a moment-to-moment way, informing my ability to make art. So I've been making welded steel sculpture now for almost 20 years, between 15 and 20 years. And I've made probably 150 pieces. The reason I haven't made more is because it's such hard work, and many of my pieces are very big and very heavy. I find that my source for material is almost always a salvage yard. That for me, going in through a salvage yard is like going to the Library of Congress. There are all these forms that are inherently sculptural that are the rejects of the processes of industry. And I have found it very compelling to be involved in an artistic process where the material defines the art. I just sort of make certain aesthetic decisions about relationships. And again, all my years as a gallerist, you know, when you set up a booth, you can have 100 objects in a booth. And I have seen dealers come to shows and they just bring their plastic boxes and they just throw the stuff on the tables. And it's a lot less work, but there's no coherence there. One learns over time that if you have a little studio pot and a little bronze sculpture and then maybe a painting, if you arrange them in a certain way, you can move these objects 1 inch one way or 1 inch another way, but the visual effect of those 3 objects will change dramatically depending upon how you arrange them. And this is the essence of sculpture. Color and form arranged in the most powerful, evocative manner. And this is where my career has evolved to. This is what I try to do every day when I try to assemble something that I'm happy with. And I think the pieces upstairs speak to that. Thank you.
Would you be willing to take some questions? Or?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Stephen?
We have a couple of pieces that are labeled for someone, for a person.
You mean, like for John Storrs?
Yes.
Yeah.
There are pieces that say that.
There are artists. I love reading about artists.
Okay.
And there are artists who I can tell from their work. What's expressed in their work is their consciousness, the consciousness of the artist. And I find that very absorbing and interesting. So I think the piece that is entitled "For John Storrs," it really is very John Storrs-like. It's what I like about his work, the forms that he repetitively used, and so it's really an homage to him. I do a lot of homages because I have so much. I've done 2 homages in the last 2 months for Magritte because the inspiration for the work was from the memory of a piece of his. I just did a piece called Chateau Detroit, and he did a famous Magritte painting as of this big rock suspended above the ocean, and on top of the rock is like a little chateau. It was called Chateau des Pyrénées. And when I saw this piece of crushed auto body, orange auto body with this gorgeous color that had just been crushed by a machine, and I saw it lying in the sand, and I said, I cannot improve on that, but I can put it in relationship with something else, and immediately thought of Magritte. So it had to be, he gave me the idea, so I have to pay him homage.
Do you like to weld?
Do I like what?
To weld?
It's alchemical. It's a magical thing, welding. And on the other hand, I know guys who weld mower decks and trailer bodies ad infinitum, and I'm sure they don't find much romantic about it. But there is something about welding. Welding was an amazing discovery because when you put a hood on and you're looking into that intensely bright arc, it's like you're looking into another world, and where things become things that are extremely hard suddenly become malleable and movable and joinable.
I went to an ice sculpture, where they made ice sculptures. And somebody said to them, how do you do this? And he looked at the big block of ice and he said, well, I just see it, and then I carve it out. And I thought, well, I'm seeing this big hunk of ice. So when you do your sculptures and you go to the salvage yard, before you go to the salvage yard, have you got an idea what you're looking for?
No.
No, so you go and you...
I go wander around the salvage yard, and it's such a pleasurable experience. I mean, it is a viscerally pleasurable experience. I walk along these aisles and aisles of stuff that has been hauled in there, bought at auctions in remote places, hauled there on a flatbed, dumped off into the sand. Sometimes I had the great good fortune of utilizing a yard called the Morrow Yard in Floral City, Florida. It was a 30-acre salvage yard, family yard, and the old man he loved getting stuff for nothing. And he would haul it in there and he'd dump it off, and then he'd find something else and he'd dump that off on top of what he just dumped off. so the stuff would sink down into the sand. And it had been that way for 25 years. And, you know, when the price of scrap would go up, the international price of scrap, they, for their cash flow, they would load up these barge wagons and take them down to Tampa to the big yards to be converted. But when they did that, they would uncover a whole layer. So from week to week, as I would go by regularly, I would find things that there was no way I could have known they were there before because they'd been uncovered. Like I think that, as I said a minute ago, I felt such pleasure and relief from having the material help me. You know, there's something about utilizing your imagination to create something that is too self-centered for me. It's a little too egotistical. That the material has had a life of its own. It's been involved with human beings and human endeavors, and then it's been cast aside. But the pleasure I've felt is in recognizing that. You know, just a glimpse of certain color old paint, a form that's been torqued or compressed, and that's when the ideas occur to me.
What was your first sculpture? Was it the gathering gun?
No. First sculpture actually was a ready-made in Duchampian terminology. You know, Marcel Duchamp found a wine bottle rack, and he just put it in context and called it a work of art. And he turned the whole art world on its ear, you know. But the first sculpture I made was actually a base plate for a huge pneumatic press. And it just had such a wonderful arrangement of holes in it that, and that was recognizable with the simple act of standing it on its end. So I stood it on its end and mounted it on a base. And that was my first sculpture.
How many pieces do you actually have mounted at your house?
How many pieces? Oh, boy.
I
Well,
think your wife knows.
huh?
I think your wife knows.
Yeah. Well, our house is. You know, you should come over.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. There's.
150, maybe, Steve. Yeah, something like that. Don't you think?
Oh, you mean sculptures all around?
All around.
Yeah, there's 150 anyway.
Some real big ones outside, some small.
And there's always something new to see. I think every time I go, there's something new that Stephen's worked on
Yeah.
that just kind of blows me away. So
Yeah.
How long between sculptures? Do you ever like spend, how much time do you spend after you finish one before you start another one? Yeah.
It really varies. And it, you know, there's what, in the culture that we live in, there's not much credit given to idleness. But I find that idleness is really important to me as a creative resource.
Steve, just let me interject that for the past 3 days, he's just been sitting in a chair and looking outside in the big cold, sort of looking at some pieces of metal, moving them around a little bit, right?
Yeah, and also the idleness of, you know, having a, I mean, that was the great thing about the yard and about salvage yards in general,
Yeah.
is that when you don't have a specific focus, instead of giving yourself a headache trying to create a focus, you just go sort of walk among all the possibilities, and it has a very therapeutic effect, and when a relationship will present itself, and when it does, then usually the motivation comes.
I heard Vermont, I heard Florida. What's the relationship to Iowa?
My wife Carlene was born and raised in Decorah. We met in Vermont. She was my nurse when I was in the hospital. And we got married 10 weeks after we met. And then we decided it was too cold in Vermont. And then we lived in Florida for 26 years. Key West, a little town called Floral, and then a little town called Floral City, about 60 miles north of Tampa.
And then we came back,
And then we came back.
because I grew up on a farm in Iowa with lots of brothers and sisters.
And the Department of Motor Vehicles, when they saw where we were moving from and where we were moving to, refused to give us licenses without psychiatric evaluation.
Do you use heavy equipment when you make these big pieces?
Yeah. I have learned how to move heavy things by myself, but there are certain things which is too dangerous to move. So what I should have done long ago was bought an all-terrain forklift, but I didn't. But now I have a crane on my trailer. I have chain fall in front of my shop. I have, you know, hand trucks on steroids. I have, you know, and I have had a very devoted neighbor farmer who runs a junk shop. He doesn't milk cows or harvest corn anymore. He converted his barn into a big junk shop. And whenever I go over to his place, he takes me for every dime. But for 10 years, he has moved when I call him, he appears with his big John Deere and front end loader and moves my sculpture however I want them moved and will not take a cent.
What do you take with you to the salvage yard?
What do I take with me? Oh, to pick things up?
Yeah.
I have a 16-foot trailer. And they're very, you know, that's the other thing that's really rich about sort of, you know, Sir Francis Bacon, the great British modernist painter, is famous for having said, the best thing I ever did was not go to art school. There is something to be said for not being too immersed in the formal art world, because it allows you to rub shoulders with more of the sort of real running around working world. And I've had some great relationships with people who run salvage yards. They're real yang places. But you know, there's a lot of humanity underneath it once you get done on
Have you been to our salvage yards? We have
Does Fort Dodge have a salvage yard?
They have an automotive one out west of town, then they have a metal, scrap metal place, and he's got
Oh, I'll have to get the name of this
I don't
person.
remember the name, but.
You know, the yards are just like everything else. That's, in the last 2 or 3 decades, you know, you remember when there were many different propane companies? Some of them sort of like little mom and pop, had been owned by the same couple for, and then they started to be bought up by AmeriGas, these other bigger concerns. The same thing has happened to the salvage yards. There were family salvage yards. They were accessible. They'd let you in without a hard hat, you know. But then they started to be bought up by big multinational corporations, and they changed the rules. But there's still ones that you can access, you know, as an individual.
He's Mike, because I donated some metal one time, and I'm driving down this old, you know, dirt road, and it's just, they just kind of said, I'll put it anywhere.
These two took a loan once.
Any other questions for Stephen? If not, we'll like to say thank you, Stephen, for finishing the Make sure that if you haven't had a chance, grab something to eat. We got plenty out there. And also to remember to check our Facebook and our website for other things to do, because we always have something to do here at the museum. So thank you again, and enjoy and go peruse the artwork again. So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.